Welcome to the Policy Committee meeting for March the 23rd. We'll start the meeting with a roll call. I'll start with Mr. Epps.
Present.
Mr. Burdell Williams.
Present.
Mr. Schultz.
Present.
Thank you. And I wanted to acknowledge that another board member, Leah Mulhern, is on the call as well. Next on the agenda is approval of the February 16, 2022 minutes from the virtual policy committee meeting. Do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes, Zachary Epps.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second, Charles Burdell Williams.
Great. All those in favor of approving those minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The minutes are approved. Next on the agenda, we'll go to old business, policy in AR 803, the school calendar. And I'll turn this over to Ms. Jackson and Mr. Diazio.
Ed, are you going to share the your screen or?
Yeah, it looks as though the screen share function. Oh wait, now it's okay. I tried a minute ago and it said disabled. Hold on one second. Okay. So we can go to 803 here. And if the committee remembers, we were removing from the regulation last month the language about school starting before or after Labor Day, and simply wanted to build in language about the stakeholders that are consulted in the development of the calendar, and make reference to the fact that multiple years of calendars could be adopted at once and could be periodically reviewed. I believe those were that was the feedback from last month.
I'm going to go out to the board to see if there are any questions about policy, excuse me, policy AR, actually 803. I don't see any questions. So as presented, AR 803 will be posted at the next legislative meeting. Okay, next on the agenda is policy in AR 310, overtime.
Yes, we added legal references here with hyperlinks to the laws that were discussed last month. Otherwise, I believe the policy has stayed relatively consistent. I believe we may have added this language about the collective bargaining agreement and board resolution. I think that was a comment from last month. And then in the administrative regulation, there were no changes, I don't believe, from last month. So relatively similar to what the committee saw last month.
Okay, thank you. Any board questions? Seeing none as well, the policy will go forward for adoption at the 4/12 legislative meeting, and the AR will be posted at that time as well. Okay, next on the agenda is policy in AR 353, professional development.
Yes, so 353, this is a new policy. I don't believe that there were changes since last month.
Yeah.
The only thing we did in the meantime confirm that the district's practice of holding induction once per year is an acceptable practice, that the law doesn't require multiple induction sessions each year. So the district's current practice is acceptable. We did look into that based on a question last month.
Which, I'm sorry, Mr. Diazio, when you say our current practice, what do you believe is our current practice?
My understanding was that induction took place once per year.
No, it's changed.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. So what's the current, how does induction currently work?
so we still have the 15 hours. However, we do about 3 or 4 of those hours in August. And then we spread the remainder of the 10 hours throughout the school year.
Okay,
In order to support new teachers and to make sure that they're receiving support and assistance as the year goes on, as opposed to a one-shot deal. That way they're always in touch with the Office of Ed and receiving updated information and updated support as it comes along, as opposed to receiving everything in August and not hearing back from the induction program during the year.
understood. And then if you hire a professional staff member, for example, in the middle of the year, January, they're going to be there for the rest of the year. Do they participate in the sessions remaining for that year, or do they start the following year?
They can participate in the remaining sessions and still are required to complete the 15 hours.
Okay.
So it
then
depends on how many hours they complete, what's left over. But yes, they can join in the middle of the year. And that's another reason why we changed the way we do the induction, because when people joined us after August, they were kind of just out on their own for a year without that.
Got it. And that practice is also fine. So the law doesn't have any requirements about when it needs to take place or anything like
Yeah.
that. It just simply states that you have to have an induction program for certain new employees. And it sounds like the district has a compliant process in place.
Okay, thank you. Any school board questions? I see Mr. Schultz's hand is raised. Mr. Schultz, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, and I missed I wasn't here for the meeting last month, so I don't know the context, or maybe this was already discussed, but is this policy at all, I know professional development attendance in the past has been a source of challenge. And is this a place where it would be appropriate to add language to give administration more, teeth or something to, or have more clarity for our employees around expectations around professional development attendance, and the expectation that if a session is missed, that they are, obligated to make up that lesson.
I think you likely have to do that through your collective bargaining agreements and through your policies on attendance and your practices on staff attendance. And I know that that's an issue and something that has been worked on, but I think the best place to do that is through the labor relations process as opposed to this policy. I think that's where you're going to see that that's more effective.
Yes, and that's what we've been told over the years. Each time that comes up, that we have to make that as a part of our CBA conversations.
And
And Dan, we
there's
did have
language.
some-
I'm sorry,
Go
Mrs.
ahead,
Hale.
Dr. Yep, go ahead,
I was
Dr.
just
Strickland.
going to confirm for Mr. Schultz that there's language currently that's in some of the proposed,
No, that,
Yeah, we shouldn't talk about.
yeah,
but I'm just, to answer, you raised the question, I'm just
yeah,
saying.
don't, yeah,
there's
yeah.
language that's out there.
And I'll say, Mr. Schultz, we did have a abbreviated discussion about just the question that you raised the last time that we met.
Okay, great,
And
thank you.
there's language in here that I think, Mr. Diazio, if I'm not mistaken, that talks about this would be consistent with the CBA, the professional education plan.
Correct.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And Mr. Schultz, I think just so you know, we all hear what you're saying. And, like I said, I think it's addressed and being addressed elsewhere.
Yep.
Mr. Schultz, did you have any other questions? Okay. hand
No,
is-
sorry, I was finding the lower hand button. Thank you.
Not a problem. Any other board questions or comments? If not, this will be posted for adoption at the next legislative meeting with the AR posted as well. Next on the agenda is policy and AR 307.
Yes, this is the student teachers and other interns policy. No changes were made to the policy, and there were no changes made to the regulation either. So no changes since the committee saw this last month.
Okay. Thank you. Any board questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, then this will also be
Okay, what I
presented.
have, I
Yeah.
just have one addition.
Sure.
And there was an attachment to the AR, I believe, that was a document that was given, that is to be given to students to sign, saying that they understand what the policy is. So my understanding, and Dr. Smith, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have not been using that. Do we plan on using that moving forward, or is that something that we need to remove?
So under the proposed new regulation, we took it out so that the policy and regulation would match the current practice. But if at some point in the future, there is something that student teachers need to affirm, we can certainly add it to the regulation. Usually what happens is the staff member that's responsible for overseeing the student teacher will review the applicable policies and practices, and that individual always maintains responsibility for the students and overall management of the classroom. But if there was anything in the future that you ever wanted your student teachers to sign off on, we can certainly add that at that time. But I think the policy and the AR stand on their own for now, at least.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Any other board questions or comments? Okay, also seeing none, this will be posted for adoption at the next legislative meeting, as well as the AR posted as well. We're switching now to new business on the agenda, starting with policy 11, principles for governance and leadership.
Yes, so this policy did not have a date on it previously, but it looks like it was adopted sometime back around 2016 or 17 based on the PSBA stamp at the bottom of it. PSBA's principles for governance and leadership haven't changed. The actual content of them remains the same. Generally, school boards will reaffirm these principles every few years as new board members come on board. Cheltenham has always been has always subscribed to and signed on to these principles. So we updated the policy just to, it exactly matches the PSBA principles. And then just so the committee knows, after the board adopts these, PSBA is always interested in the most recent date that the boards adopt. So once the board moves forward with this, I'll go ahead and alert PSBA. You can just do it. It's an online form that you complete to let them know that the board and your name will get listed with the other hundreds of school districts that sign on to these. So we'll take care of that for you as well.
Yeah, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Diazio, I think the board early on in January, I think Ms. Henry had proposed adoption of these governance principles, and I thought we had adopted them at the January legislative meeting, if I'm not mistaken.
It may well have been. So some boards do it by board action, some do it via policy, some do it via both. So if they were adopted, this would have been what was adopted, because these have not changed since last year.
Okay, thank you. I see Mr. Epps' hand is raised. Go ahead, Mr. Epps.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Recognizing that these are taken from the PSBA, Under evaluate continuously, I'm a fan of making things explicit, and so this is where the interest comes from. And evaluate continuously, I just wondered to what extent we could recognize the district's use of disaggregated data to really discover the specific needs of students under that evaluate continuously category. To what extent that would be appropriate or even needed.
I don't see any reason why it can't be. I don't think that fundamentally changes these principles. So I don't think there's any problem with adding that. Maybe in this first bullet point, where it says utilize appropriate data, maybe putting after that, a comma and saying like including disaggregated data or something like that.
I was looking at that one or the third bullet, certainly, and that's my and I also hearing this is a proposal. So I recall in another recent committee that there's a comprehensive measurement system underway, and so that's also what I'm thinking about. And I recall I'd also, that's why I'm asking to what extent it would be appropriate as well. I know the district does it, and so as explicit as we can be about that, with the interest also being clear of how that lines up with our efforts towards equity along different categories, including race and gender and other ways of identity. I'll pause there. I think, like you said, it's not, I don't think it's too complicated, but yeah, I'll stop there.
I think, Mr. Epps, that's a good addition, because that is consistent with our current practice. I don't think it effectively materially changes the intent of that portion of the governance principles. So I would be in favor of adding something to the effect that Mr. Diazio suggested. Mr. Schultz, I see your hand is raised as well.
Yeah, thank you. I have a much more incredibly minor. There's a bunch of white space at the end of communicate clearly's last bullet. So just want to throw that out there. Under honor the sanctity of executive session, if you highlight that, you'll see there's spaces afterwards. There you go.
Oh,
yep. I often select things when I read. It's the only reason I noticed it. So this policy in general is almost like a mission statement for the way the board operates, correct? Because we're not getting into, unlike other policies, it's not really actionable so much as a set of steps. It's a lens that we are kind of charging our board to look through as we operate.
That was my understanding, Mr. Schultz, that this was kind of governance principles that guided school boards throughout Pennsylvania that were established by PSBA several years ago. And annually, they ask school boards to adopt these principles as kind of a uniform governance, overarching governance principles for school boards to follow.
Got it. That makes sense. And I guess not to, this isn't a suggestion because I think it would be a large amount of work and the answer is almost all policies, but some of these items, I mean, Mr. Epps, as you were talking, I was thinking we must have a policy somewhere that actually does with more detail go into stuff. I fully agree with the suggested additional language in this one, but cross-referencing policies that are related specifically to certain things, or better mapping it to what have we said that we must do related to these items. I'd be curious just in terms of, if we're saying here as a board we're going to utilize data, making it very easy to know exactly what we've said in terms of policy around how we're going to utilize data seems potentially valuable either to new board members or to members of the public looking at this policy. So.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Schultz, this is basically kind of governing principles. And are you asking to kind of crosswalk each of the headers to specific board policies that support the principal?
I
Or
don't
just-
think we actually need to do it. I think that'd be too large of a task. I was talking to try to understand the purpose of this policy because it is a little bit different than other policies we would. Other policies we would want to do that, but this is more of a almost a resolution in the form of a policy, but because it's a continuous resolution, that's why. So thank you. I don't have any requested changes other than that white space, but
I do have a material actual suggested, maybe not, suggested change, more in terms of, I don't have the language, but because equity is a large guiding principle for the district and the board when we're looking at policy and governing, I would like to see equity embedded someplace as part of these principles, because that is effectively what we do focus on or try to focus on. So maybe govern effectively with equity principles in mind, or.
I was just going to say, I think the govern effectively category is probably where that can, be embedded, whether it's developing, adopting, revising, and reviewing policy through an equity lens, or aligning decisions to policy, and the board's, commitment to, it doesn't have to just be equity. It can be equity and other things. So I think there's a couple different places we can put it. We can talk through it now, or if you'd like me to come back with or propose something before the board meeting for review, either way.
Yeah, I think because this will be first read, and in light of the fact that do believe that we had kind of maybe informally adopted the principles back in January, I do think it's an opportunity when we're looking at the actual policy to add that language. I think that would be a good add for the board to look at before we maybe re-adopt these principles.
All right, and it sounds like the committee also agrees with the additional language around disaggregated data. So I'll put that in there as well.
Great. Any other board comments? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Diazio, you'll add that language, and then this will be proposed as a first read at the legislative meeting. Okay. Next on the agenda is policy 914, parent involvement.
Yes, so this one, and there's a few on here that are proposed for repeal this month, and I'm actually going to just temporarily reject the deletion here because I wanted to explain. We have a lot of policies that address parent involvement. So as an initial matter, we have a Title I parental involvement policy, which is required under Title I to include specifically parents with respect to Title I programming. That's a very narrow policy that just relates to Title I. But as the board also knows, we have the equity policy, and one of the provisions of the equity policy talks about a welcoming school environment, an environment that takes into consideration all stakeholders. That policy more comprehensively reflects the district's current position on parent involvement. The board may also remember from maybe a year or so ago, we combined policies 212 and 213, which were assessing student progress and reporting student progress. And we put a lot of language into the AR about how we communicate with with parents about student progress and things like that in school. We have our volunteers policy, which talks about welcoming parents into the school to be involved in decision-making and participating in school activities. And so it just, and then we also have policy on like outside organizations, which would include PTOs and things like that. So it looked like a lot of the language was duplicative of what was in other policies. There wasn't a whole lot of substance to this policy. And then there were also some things that just, as I read the policy, For example, under the purpose here, providing all district students with equal access to a quality education, and equal access is not a term that is consistent with where we currently are, right? We talk about equitable access. We talk about, so it just looked like this was ripe to remove, given all the other work that we've done in recent years with policies that I think addresses this. I lead with all of that introduction because when you are repealing a policy on parent involvement, sometimes it begs the question, well, why are we repealing that? And I just wanted the committee to have the context that we're not substantively changing or discouraging parent involvement. It's just that we look at all of our policies with an eye towards involving parents as key stakeholders in everything we do. And it's embedded in all of our other policies. So I hope that was helpful. And if there's any questions, happy to address them.
Thank you, Mr. Diazar. That was actually really helpful. Any board questions about the proposal to repeal policy 914 because the language is covered in other related policies? Mr. Schultz?
Thank you. And thank you for that explanation as well. The first bullet under guidelines that talks about sort of communication expectations. Do we have a policy related to communication expectations? Not just with parents, frankly, but with anybody who is trying to communicate with the members of our district?
I believe, and let's just confirm here. We have.
That's why I couldn't find it. I was looking in the wrong spot.
We had an overall communications policy because I thought we just looked at it not too long ago. It's the board meetings policy. Here's our public relations policy, which talks about communication here, ways in which
Right.
stakeholders can communicate general guidelines. There's not a whole lot here, but it's probably in 921 is where you would find it.
Okay. I will just say that, to me, PR is different than the kind of communication that's captured in this particular bullet, which is really focused on treating parents as a, collaborator in their students' activities. And frankly, I think it's not even the same as the kind of communication we would want to have with members of the public as well, where I think the PR policies communications is more oriented towards the blast out to everyone. How do we shape our image or communicate emergent information, et cetera, versus how do we work with individuals on an individual level. So that's the one, and that this may be captured in one of the other policies you listed, but it does feel important that it's, and maybe it's not, but it feels important at first to have something somewhere talk about, look, parents are not just people who drop their kids off. They're also not just people who volunteer at PTOs. They are people who we want to have ongoing two-way meaningful information shares about a child, like partners in their child's education. If that is captured elsewhere, fine, or great even. But if not, I would want to understand whether that is meaningful to capture in policy. I know it's operation. I know we're going to continue to do it, but to me, that isn't necessarily a reason to remove it from a policy, because we want to make sure it continues to happen. So that was my only question.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, a good one. So 212, this just talks about student progress and talks about parent involvement in receiving information about their students' progress, participation you'll see here in parent-teacher conferences, working with parents to have communication in between report periods to communicate any potential concerns. So that's from an academic standpoint. When you move to, I believe, and I haven't looked at it in the last few days here, but I believe in the equity policy, let me find it. We talk about welcoming and school environments. We talk about sort of creating these like family ambassadors to include families in ways that they, feel valued and supported as stakeholders. So again, it's embedded. We also talk down here about striving to meaningfully engage families, in our equity work. So I think we have, the equity component covered. We have the academic component covered. In our volunteers policy, we talk about the contributions that parents make to enhancing educational experiences for students and promoting and encouraging that involvement. So it's in different policies, as I think I kind of mentioned at the beginning. But if it needs to be anywhere else, we can certainly have discussion. But that's the background that I've been able to find.
Thank you.
Mr. Schultz, does that satisfy your concern? It seems like it's embedded in multiple places, not as stated in this particular policy, but generally in other policies.
It does for the purposes of moving this forward, and likely just does. I wonder if maybe there's room for or what I'm curious what other districts do around this more one-on-one communication. If there is policy language, we might just, again, more broadly than just parents, if we should consider that or not. But
we can definitely think about an overall communications policy. And for some reason, I thought we looked at that a while back, but maybe it was something that I'll have to see if we put it somewhere else or, but let me review that, and then I'll talk with Mr. Kaufman offline, and we can maybe make some recommendations for a future meeting. I'm actually wondering, what I think I'm thinking of is, I think we did a social media policy not too long ago, and that may have been what I'm thinking about, since a lot of the district's communication is through electronic means. But I'll revisit that before the next meeting so that we can talk through that a little bit more.
Right. And maybe communications isn't even the right word so much as community involvement, the parent and community involvement, and what is the operational involvement and strategic involvement of that stakeholder group, where, and again, that it's just, it feels like a very important stakeholder. I mean, we have an entire section for employees, we have an entire section for pupils, and we have an entire section for community. These are the bastions of our stakeholder groups.
Sure.
So that makes sense. All right, thank you. Yeah, and yes, Ms. Haywood, I am comfortable moving forward.
Okay, so we'll move policy 914, parent involvement, forward for repeal, well, proposed repeal as a first read at the legislative meeting. And I think it'll be important to provide as part of the report for the policy committee, kind of the rationale as to why we are proposing repeal of this policy and mentioning the other policies that we already have in place that address parent involvement, parent and guardian involvement. And in the meantime, Mr. Diazio will explore other policies that may be in place in other school districts related specifically to communication in general with various stakeholders.
Excellent.
Okay, great. Then moving on to the next agenda item, policy 216, assignment within district.
Yes, so this was another one where we had some formatting issues with the old policy. So you'll see that a lot of the language is proposed new here, but it's actually not really new. We added some hyperlinks and cross references here. I wanted to note this new way that we're cross referencing our policies, just to make sure the committee likes that. We're putting both the policy number and then also the name of the policy, which I think is helpful. So that's something we're going to, as long as the committee, and I see people nodding their heads, we'll continue that practice. I think that's helpful. So that was 216. There's a process in the law, which we have in the AR. This is a new AR. The school code requires us to just have a process through which families with twins or higher order multiples can make decisions about whether their children should be in the same classroom setting, in different classrooms, and how you involve the principal in those decisions. And then ultimately, if there's a disagreement, how that gets resolved. So that this language comes pretty closely from the school code and is, my understanding, consistent with the current practice that the building administrator would be the family's primary point of contact in discussing appropriate placement for twins. Just so the committee's aware, that the current policy language that I carried forward from the old policy is that if you move from one attendance area to another attendance area during the school year, you can continue to stay in your former school for the rest of the current school year. You just have to provide, parent just has to provide transportation. So you're living in Cheltenham Elementary zone, you move to Wyncote zone, you can stay in Cheltenham Elementary for the rest of the year, but you just have to get transported back and forth because the buses don't go that way. So that was the what was in the current policy. Some districts, will say, if it's after January 1st, then you can stay, but I just left the language that has always been here, but the board and the committee would have some discretion over that topic if you wanted to revisit it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Diazio, for the background. That's very helpful in terms of the changes. I see Mr. Epps's hand is raised. Mr. Epps?
Thank you. I noticed as well weren't many changes. One thing I did notice was in the updated version, it's not clear how a parent a guardian might initiate that request process. That is clear in the old version. I wonder to what extent, is that intentional, or might we want to add some of that specificity back?
Mr. Diaz, is that in the AR?
I think it's, may I jump in? I'm sorry.
Yep, sure, Dr. Smith.
I think it's intentional in that, that the district wants children who, move out of the area to stay at the school where they were, and then to move to the next school because of spacing and class size and so on and so forth, to maintain children who are outside of their area takes up space for kids who are in the area. So I think that is it, but I don't have that's all I have to contribute, just for clarity.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Because I think there is a sense to discourage keeping kids out of their home school outside of extenuating circumstances.
Yeah,
and I'll add to that that I believe the process when you change your address in the district is you go through the registrar's office through student services as opposed to through the superintendent's office. And an attendance zone exception that meets the requirements of this policy would not necessarily need a superintendent approval. The registrar would be able to maintain that. And I think that was also part of the reason there. It was a good question, though.
Correct. Thank you.
Yeah, full transparency. I'm a parent of twins and we moved. And so we are going through this. So it's good to hear the intention. My question was more broader, but it's good to hear that intention in terms of just as a standard, keeping students at their home school. And so but I do want, it does say there, the superintendent or designee may grant exceptions to this policy. And so to that end, when would exceptions be made? To what, like, what would the process for exceptions, given that that's there? I do still wonder, like, what else do we need to say about that? If exceptions are being made, then what is the process that exceptions would be made?
The times, Mr. Epps, where I've seen them is, for example, and we don't see it very frequently, but if you have two students who, whether it's because of things that are happening in school or outside of school, or just having a severe amount of conflict with one another, and parents want them separated, and it's in the best interest of everyone to maintain a separate placement, or if there's a program that's operating at one school and only operates at one school, or there's an educational that on a student specific basis, if we identify a need of a student and that opportunity only exists in one place, this policy gives the superintendent the ability to say, we can grant that exception in those cases, but it's usually student specific, and the administration may have additional items to add, but that's what I'm used to seeing.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have moved students, for example, to your point, who need special educational programming. For example, Cheltenham Elementary has a program that the other elementaries K through 4 do not have. So once students test into that program or are evaluated and they have that program, we move them and we don't count it against their homeschool attendance. So that has been one instance, and everything else you gave examples for, Ed, that's how it's been, but it's been very, I guess, rare.
Yeah.
Is the word?
Yeah, it generally is. Yep.
And Mr. Epps, I guess the question is, because there may be a varying circumstances that would warrant an exception, we may, do we want to put some examples, including but not limited to examples, as a way to flesh out a little more detail in the policy without putting every possible exception that could arise?
Can I try? Do I need to raise my hand? Yeah.
I'm kind of posing that as a middle ground.
Could I add to that? Because I wonder if, hearing the intention, I wonder if it's even language that's closer to the district will decide at what point, like when a scenario would be appropriate for an exception. Because as I read it, as I hear it and read it, the district doesn't necessarily want parents to request the change. The district wants to be able to see an educational need for the change and then make it on the district side, not necessarily having parents request it. Is that what I'm hearing in terms of the intention?
The time when this comes up where the district generally wants to discourage requests is when you have, for example, a parent who says, well, I live in, I'm going to make this up, I live in Glenside's attendance area, but my child's after school provider is located in Wincote's attendance zone, and for childcare purposes, I'd like my child to go to school over here. And those are not, we can't, if that was how we were grouping our students, that we would have kids everywhere, right? And we wouldn't be able to, the transportation would become unmanageable. So those are the requests that sometimes school districts will get. And we point to this policy to say there has to be a reason that's based on what the student needs and the educational programming of the student that would justify us moving that. We can't just move students because of convenience or things like that. That's where it generally comes up.
I have a better example. A family moves down the street. You move out of a zone. That was literally what happened to us. And so, that perfectly makes sense. And so I would then say, I would retract my proposal and then say, given the intention to have the language clearly having language that clearly shows that these decisions are, there's that sentence there, educational program and the financial and logistical goals of the district. But then that next piece, requests for attendance zone. So if the intention is that the district is mainly making the decisions, that isn't clear to me in this language. And so I'll pause there, but I don't know that I would retract my proposal around some specificity around that request process.
Okay, so just to clarify, Mr. Epson, I also kind of withdraw my proposal as well. I do think that the language that you just recited is reflective of some deference to the administration in terms of what would be looked at in terms of determining an exception. And for the next sentence, are you asking for more specificity in terms of when those requests for attendance zone exceptions would be granted?
No, that was more for parents or guardians to know how they could even make the request. So like, is the form online? Do you have to reach out to someone? Like, how would you even make the request? In the previous version, it was very clear, like you had to do it by March, you got to reach out to this person will make the decision. And so that's not, because the request is there, if someone wanted to make a request, they wouldn't know how based upon this current language.
Mm-hmm. And I guess right now for Dr. Smith and Dr. Scriven, how would that be made? Would that be made directly to the attendance office or the Director of Student People Services?
But tell me exactly which part you're talking about. I'm not.
The attendance zone exceptions. Any requests for attendance zone exceptions?
Oh, that would go to, that would initially go to the registrar. And then the registrar, if it's not extenuating circumstances, or if it's not anything that is kind of out of the ordinary, they'll send it to my office to say, this person or this family wants to do A, B, and C. This is the reason. This isn't one of the reasons we've used in the past to give an exception. And my office typically supports the registrar, and I just let the superintendent know that the request was made and why the request was denied. And I can tell you, so I can give you an example. Last year, for example, we had students, because of COVID, who hadn't been in their buildings and things like that. We looked at those in a much different lens. And some, I want to say there was maybe 2 exceptions because of that. We've also had situations where, trying to think of another one, there aren't that many, where the registrar has walked them over. Yeah, it's been like programmatic, like if a kid, for example, gets evaluated and their education program changes, but typically the decision is made at the registrar's office, and they just advise me of the decision, and I make the superintendent aware, because we have had families, once they're made aware that they can't change, they'll call and say, well, we really liked it at X, Y, and Z school. And so what we have said is, if your kid, for example, if a student were to move now and stay at their home school for 3rd grade, we do not force 4th graders to spend 1 year in another building. But the younger kids, knowing that we're making a 2-year, 3-year, 4-year commitment, the registrar doesn't send those to my office. They stop them right there at their office. So I would say that's the only time. If there's a 3rd grade, if a kid has been in the schools for kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, and they move in the middle of 3rd grade, those kids typically stay in their home, in that school, for 4th grade, because it's so disruptive to have a kid in a building for 4 years, and then their 5th year, because they move, we send them to another school.
So to resolve this issue, would it be appropriate just to add language that requests for attendance zone exceptions should be submitted to the registrar, and then period, and then exceptions will not be granted if, and keeping the rest of that sentence as is?
Yes, I think that works.
Okay.
Thank you.
Got it.
I see the thumbs up from Mr. Epps, so I think that works. Thank you for that question, Mr. Epps. I'm on mute talking to myself. Any other comments or questions regarding policy 216? a good conversation. Okay, so with those changes, which I don't think are material, Mr. Diazio, this will be presented for first read at
Correct.
the next legislative meeting.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Alrighty, moving on to the next agenda item, policy in AR 207, confidential communications of students.
Yes. Not a whole lot changing with the policy here. The changes are really to the administrative regulation, and we really just streamlined the administrative regulation. The policy here is intended to help guide staff when students are sharing information or staff become aware of information about students through things like internet and social media, how they should handle that. Now, the prior policy spoke specifically to pregnancy and reproductive health decisions, and that does come up from time to time. And also the internet and social media, that does come up, but it doesn't come up, sort of the issues around social media and internet. They've been around for so long. I think we staff generally know how to navigate that, so that the committee knows a big thing that we're seeing these days is students who are have gender identities that are either in transition or there's issues around how to tell people. That's a really big issue that counselors are frequently dealing with. That is not addressed in this policy currently. Ms. Keene and I are working on bringing forth proposed revisions to our transgender students policy, because we have had some student-specific issues that we've been working through. And we actually were just talking earlier this week, and Ms. Keene did some research on some best practices that she found in some other school districts and had questioned how we might be able to present them to the board for consideration. So we're going to add that policy to one of the 3 remaining agendas for this year. When we do that, it may very well be possible that this AR will come back to the committee with an added section on gender identity and transgender issues. So just know that that's a known gap in this policy currently, and we'll be addressing it in the very short future.
Mr. Diazio, do you think that it warrants postponing this policy subject to those changes to the transgender student policy?
It could be. So the conversation with Ms. Keene actually came up a couple days after these revisions were proposed for this agenda. I do think that the policy can move forward because the policy is very general. If the committee, plus that will take 2 months to get through 2 readings. So the committee could move forward with a first read on the policy and just know that there may be some additional language proposed to the AR before final adoption of the policy. I think that would be a good suggestion.
Thank you. Any board questions or comments? Okay, so we'll move this forward to a first read at the next legislative meeting with the understanding that the AR may require additional changes based on further revisions to our transgender student policy. Okay, next on the agenda is policy 707.1.
Apologies. I raised my hand just at the end. Apologies. I was wondering. Just dancing in my head a little bit. If in the scenario, I do see there was some language around staff should encourage students to talk to their parents. I think that was in the situation specific example. To what extent would staff need to let students know, hey, if you're telling, because around this confidentiality, if you're telling me these things, some things they would be required, as a mandatory reporter, to let others know, which is there. But yeah, it's to what extent it's hey, if we're going down this line, I would have to tell either your parents or some other authorities. Is that, I know that might be in the natural course of a conversation, but thinking through what that would look like in the policy.
So I think the school counselors are really good at this when the conversation is had in the context of a counseling situation. When it involves other staff members, principals, teachers, coaches, things like that, the standard we always use is if there's a genuine health and safety concern, we have to report. So if a student, for example, were to report that they were physically assaulted by another adult and now they're pregnant and they don't want anybody to know, and that would be a scenario where that would need to be reported. There's reporting laws, and students would be guided through that process to understand here's the legal requirements, and in a student friendly way, and the counselors are really good at that. But I think, and maybe it's a question for the administrative team to take back to the counselors, but my understanding is when students meet with counselors and they bring issues to them, there is kind of some understanding at the beginning of those sessions about issues involving what has to be reported, what do you tell parents? Because kids come in sometimes and want to know, like, I have something on my mind, but I haven't told anybody, and counselors can then explain what their role is and when they would be required to share with an external party, whether it be a parent or some sort of outside agency that, advocates for students.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I appreciate the example of the counselors. In my head, I was thinking through the lens of a student with the expectation of confidentiality going to a staff member with that expectation. So that's helpful.
Zachary, would it be helpful though to add language here? Because I think Ms. Diasio really shared what would happen if a student went to a counselor who's very much trained in terms of these conversations versus potentially a teacher or other staff personnel that may or may not be, just because it's just not in their wheelhouse. Would we provide some PD to general staff overall in terms of this policy and how it would be implemented?
Yeah, I started thinking about the trauma-informed care training, which is sort of related, but yes, to your point, that's what I started to think about, that there are trainings that are available to staff.
So yeah. I just, Dr. Scriven and Dr. Smith, would that be appropriate to include here in terms of acknowledgement or notice of this particular policy and maybe some appropriate training around it? So if a student went to a staff member versus a counselor, staff members would feel equally comfortable in terms of what they'd have to report and what they can tell the students they can keep confidential.
I know for myself personally, Ms. Haywood, I would like to do a little deeper dive with this, with HR and also with Ed to see. So I'm not opposed at all. Let me preface by saying that. But I need to see to what extent, what do we currently do? What are our current practices? And then what will we need to add to this to give some more specificity around the ask? So I would ask, can we circle back with
Sure.
an update?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I don't think with that, Mr. Epps, we'd have to hold up taking this to first read. I think there'd be some time between first and second read to add language if we would like. And, even if it warranted that, this could be a repeat first read if there were material changes.
Oh, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, moving along to policy 707.1. Use of school facilities regulation and enforcement.
Yes, so 707.1 and 707.2, we can probably take pretty closely together. Neither one of these policies is necessary because all of this content is addressed in 707, which was comprehensively revised in the recent past. 707.2 relates to the adult school. And just so that the committee can see it here on the screen, we built in the adult school is actually specifically contemplated as a Class A category in our use policy. And then with respect to 707.1, this really talks about like the rules that apply, just some very general rules about using our facilities, and requires the superintendent here to develop a set of procedures, and all of those procedures are in 707 along with all of these attachments. You'll see, for example, attachment B here to 707 lists many rules that apply to our facilities much more comprehensively than what's in 707.1. So that's why both of those policies are recommended for repeal.
Makes perfect sense to me. Any board questions about the proposed repeal of 707.1 and 707.2? I just want to thank everyone, Mr. Diazio, Ms. Jackson, Dr. Scriven, and Dr. Smith, for really, looking at some of these policies for possible repeal and consolidation. I think we've come a long way with kind of reducing the number of policies we have overall that are either duplicative or otherwise just not needed. So I definitely appreciate that. That takes a lot of time, I know, and a lot of attention to detail and crosswalking between policies.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Matt.
Mhm. Well, seeing no changes or comments to these two remaining policies, again, we'll propose those for repeal at the legislative meeting as a first read. And if there's nothing else, we can move to adjourn this meeting.
Ms. Haywood, I apologize. I may have missed it in the transition. Was the use of movies policy up for discussion today?
No, the use of movies was not up for discussion for today.
Okay. All right. I saw it in draft, so I must be confused. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Zachary Epps.
Mr. Epps and I will second that. All those in favor say aye.
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 Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.